Good morning. We're reading The Wheel on the School by Maynard de Jong, pictures by Maurice Sendak. We are on chapter 8, Lena and the Upturned Boat. Lena has found a wheel in Douwa's father's upturned boat. 1,000 questions seemed to bubble up in Lena. 1,000 things she absolutely had to know about the wheel in the boat and about the hole. Why had they cut a hole in the boat? And everything and every amazing thing. Lena jumped to her feet. But you couldn't shout questions across such a distance. In her excitement, with her eyes fixed on Douwa and tingling to know, Lena ran down the rounded side of the boat and jumped to the packed sea bottom. She landed hard on her hands and feet. One wooden shoe had made a splitting sound, but there was no time to think about that now. Lena picked herself up and raced across the sea bottom to the dike. But when at last she stood before old Douwa on the dike, she was too breathless for questions. Just why, the old man wanted to know, would a little girl be dancing on top of a boat because of a wagon wheel? Fortunately, he now noticed Lena's split shoe. It gave Lena a chance to catch her breath. Better carry that shoe in your hand, Douwa said. We'll go to my house and I'll staple a little fine wire over the vamp. It'll be good as new, if you don't jump from boats. But why were you doing that little dance there? You've got me as curious and inquisitive as old grandmother Sybil. When Lena had her breath back, she explained why they wanted a wheel in Shora. She hurried to get it over with so she could ask Douwa why there was a wheel under a boat, and why it seemed the most natural thing to him when really it was a miracle and a wonder. So, you need that wheel for storks, Douwa said. Well. But that square hole isn't nearly big enough to pull the wheel through, Lena told him. No, of course not, Douwa said. I cut it just big enough to pull a man through, not an inch bigger. Not an inch. A man? My father, Douwa said. That was my father's wagon wheel you saw. It saved his life. But Douwa, Lena exploded. But old Douwa shook his head and pointed out to sea. A group of storks came winging out of the sea from far away near the islands. For a while they headed straight for Shora, straight toward Douwa and Lena. But near the old boat they swerved and flapped rapidly out of sight in the direction of Ness. There must have been 20, Lena said, awed. No, exactly 12, Douwa said, but that isn't the point. If the storks are flying in flocks now, and that wheel's got to be got out of the boat, we can't stand here talking. Tomorrow's Sunday, so there are no days to waste. The tide is soon due in from the sea, so there are no hours to waste. Besides all that, there's a storm brewing far back of the islands. Lena looked all around at the sunshiny blue sky over the distant blue sea, then looked back at the old man in complete unbelief. Oh, yes, that storm's coming, Douwa said. Oh, it isn't a matter of hours. It won't come in a minute. But it's going to be such a storm that the tide won't leave the dike again for days on end. So this is our last chance to get near the boat. You see, little girl, we've no time to waste, and we'd better talk as we walk. But where are we going? What will we do? Lena said anxiously. We'll do what I did before over 80 years ago. We'll go to my house to get my saw, and it's the same saw I used to cut my father out. Then we'll hurry back and cut the hole big enough to pull the wheel out. Old Douwa, aided by his stout cane, strode along the dike so fast that Lena, hobbling on one shoe, had all she could do to keep up with him. She stumbled along in a daze, bewildered and seething with more and more questions. Lena looked eagerly up at the old man a few times. Then she burst out with it. Douwa, I've got to know why there was a wheel in a boat, or I'll explode. Douwa grinned. That's easy, he said calmly, never slackening his long stride. You see, my father was a fisherman, just like I was, and just as his father was before him. And all his life he was plagued by seasickness. He'd be sick all the weeks out on the sea and until he got back home again. He hated the sea, but it brought him his living. He was a fisherman, like his father before him, so what could he do? Grub on the land? No. But do you know what he did? He put that wagon wheel on his boat. What belongs more with a solid, steady land than a wagon wheel? Nothing. It's reasonable, isn't it? Yes, Lena said in a small voice, picturing the seasick man, seasick all his life. Oh, yes. But then how did the wagon wheel save him? There was this big storm. The fishing fleet didn't come back. It was a swift storm. It fell down on the fleet, and there was no running away from it or out from before it. Not a boat came back. I was a little boy then in Shora. A week after the storm, the tides brought in my father's boat, the only boat from the Shora fleet that ever came back. But it came back upside down. It's stranded just about where it's lying now. Nothing could have lived in an overturned boat through such a week-long storm. The whole village was in sorrow. Not a fisherman had come back. And there lay the boat like a big tomb. Nobody went near it. I was a little boy, about as old as you are now. I used to go out on the dike and stare at the boat and cry by myself every day. And a little helpless, lonely boy. One day I got queer thoughts. I began dreaming things, imagining things, because it was too awful just staring at that boat that had been my father's tomb. I made up a story for myself, that my father was still in the boat, under the boat, but alive. It wasn't his tomb. Oh, it was foolish and wild, but it was so lonely that I cried there every day. Oh, it was impossible. But it was so, wasn't it? Lena said urgently. Because it was so impossibly impossible. It was so. The old man looked at her. Precisely, he said, as if you were talking to a grown-up. Impossibly impossible. But exactly, he said. Little girl, how did you ever think of that? That's the way I wish I could have explained it, because that's the way I thought it as a child. But I had no words. Our teacher told us, Lena started to explain, but the old man was not listening. I went out to the boat, he said softly. The tide was out, the boat lay high, and there I stood beside the looming boat in the quiet sea, and I was scared, because this was my father's boat, and my father was gone. I couldn't believe my dreams out there in the sea. But just the same, I laid my ear against the side of the boat, and I listened a long time. I thought I heard faint tapping, hardly louder than the noises of the hard-shell crabs. Then I was sure, and I yelled, Dad! Dad! I screamed. Just wait, I'm coming back, Dad. I'm coming back to get you. As if he hadn't been waiting there for days. I think I kept yelling and screaming, in between crying all the way to Shora. I yelled down the street. Nobody would believe me. And my poor mother said, No, Douwa, your father's gone. Hush, boy. Oh, I couldn't stop to explain. Everybody thought I was crazy. You don't know the awful, dreadful hurry. I grabbed an axe and a saw. I ran all the way back alone. I was little, but I was strong and I was excited. I chopped a hole in the bottom of the overturned boat, and when it was big enough to push a saw through, I sawed and sawed. And every once in a while, I'd have to stop and yell, Dad, Dad, through the hole. And he answered me in a weak whisper of a voice. And then I'd saw like a maniac again. At last the hole was cut, and I could push myself in. There was my father right before me, there on the wheel. The wheel was leaning against the side of the boat. With his last strength, my father had climbed to the hub to be as close to me as possible while I saw it, to be within reach. I leaned in. I grabbed him under the arms. I lifted him out. I was small, but I was strong. Right then, I could have lifted the church and the tower. Too, my father was just a light skeleton. Lena was crying a little as she hobbled beside the old man. He was striding so fast in his excitement of living it all over again, he was almost running. It was sweet to cry about a little, but because it had happened more than 80 years ago, and it was a miracle and a wonder. Know how he lived under that boat all those days? The old man almost shouted. By climbing to the top of the wheel whenever the tide came in, so as to keep his head above water. The boat hadn't mired so deep in the sea silt then. The tide didn't flow over it the way it does now. Know what he ate? Candles. Pieces of candle that they'd had in the boat came floating around him in the flood tides. Know what he drank? Fish and crabs. He'd chew the juices out of them for a little water and spit the salty raw flesh out again. But he was a skeleton. And there I stood on the top of that boat, a boy with his father. I was almost crazy with excitement. And then, just the way you did, I ran down the side of the boat carrying my father. We landed in a heap, but I picked him up. I ran with him over the dry sea bottom and over the dike to Shora. I kicked the door open, and I yelled, Mom, here's my dad! and my mother fainted. What a day. What a great day. Together they strode along the dike, and Lena looked up at the old man in wonder. Now I'm doing it again, O'Dowd said suddenly. Almost a century later, I'm doing it again. Running home for the same saw. I'm going to do it again. Cut a hole. This time for my father's wagon wheel. And it's going on the school. You know, little girl, that is wonderful, and that is right. The wheel on the school is a sort of monument to my father, who was saved by that wheel. Oh, Lena gasped. Oh, yes, Douwa, yes. But we're going to need help to lift that waterlogged wheel out of the silt and up through the hole. Won't it be rotten? Lena asked anxiously. After almost a century? It seemed such endless ages. It'll be as sound as the day it landed there. Under the water and the moist silt, it would be almost eternal. Wood under salt water doesn't rot. Then I'm going to run and tell the teacher, Lena said. He'll ring the school bell and all the boys will come. They can help us, but it'll take a while. They're all over the countryside. Fine, the old man said. I'll get the saw and a shovel. We can start making the hole bigger and dig the wheel out of the silt while they come in from the country. Tell your teacher everybody's to hurry. The tide will soon be in. Here, give me that wooden shoe so I can fix it. No, better give me both so you can run faster and get to that school. Lena hastily handed the old man both her wooden shoes and dashed off. Far behind her, she could hear the old man's heavy cane pounding the brick in his fierce stride. There was no one in the school. The teacher was gone. The door of the school stood wide open, but there was no one. Lena rushed into the classroom and stood puzzled in the empty room. But the teacher had said he'd be at the school all day. Maybe she'd better ring the bell to make them all come. Lena darted to the portal where the bell rope hung. There was no bell rope. Lena stared bewilderedly around her. Then, with a helpless shrug, she dashed out of the portal and back to the village and old Douwa. The whole village seemed deserted. The street lay empty. Even Grandmother Sybil III wasn't sitting on her stoop. Lena rushed on, looking everywhere. She came to a dead stop in the middle of the street. The gate to Giannis's high-fenced backyard stood wide open. It was startling. It had never happened before. For a split second, Lena considered dashing in there. Oh, but that was silly. Giannis had no legs. He'd be useless. In desperation, Lena ran right past Alva's house to the dike to see if, from the high dike, she could find any of the boys or the teacher somewhere in the level, flat fields. There was nothing in all the fields except the stooping figures of the farm workers. Lena turned to look at the faraway upturned boat. There was old Douwa striding out along the dike toward the boat, an axe and a shovel and a coil of rope thrown over his shoulder. He hurried along with his big stout cane. He was carrying her shoes in his other hand. Douwa hadn't even waited for her. On silent, stockinged feet, Lena ran after him along the top of the dike. From a distance, Jana, the wife of Giannis, coming home with her yoke and empty bread baskets, saw old Douwa rushing along the dike with a saw and shovel. Jana was far out along the road. She'd been peddling bread to the outlying farms between Shora and Ness. Now there came Lena running hard after the old man. Jana set her baskets down in the middle of the road, rested her yoke, and stood and stared. Old Douwa plunged down the seaside of the dike and disappeared from Jana's view. A distance behind him, Lena too ran down the dike and disappeared. Jana, in a confused way, stooped to pick up a few smooth stones from the gravel road and started to drop them in a basket. Suddenly she grabbed up her yoke and baskets and took off for Shora as fast as she could. Her billowing skirts fluttered.